The rain lashed against the old train station as if trying to erase it from existence. The wind howled through the empty corridors, whistling between rusted metal panels. The few streetlights flickered irregularly, casting ghostly shadows over the rain-soaked pavement. There was no one there, no one except him, the dog, soaked, thin, his bones visible beneath mud-streaked fur, marked by time and scars. His eyes were deep wells of pain and resignation. He trembled but did not move. He only waited. Paulo, that was the name he had once been given. But it had been a long time since anyone had called him by it. For 5 years he had been there, motionless, trapped in a cruel fate no one could understand. During the day, he wandered through the station, scavenging through trash cans, curling up beneath the worn-out benches. But every evening, without fail, he returned to the same spot by the tracks, his eyes locked on the horizon. Waiting, the townspeople had grown used to him. Some whispered that he was a ghost, a spirit of flesh and bone condemned to relive the same moment every day. Others simply ignored him, as if unable to bear the weight of his silent sorrow. But there were those who wondered, why did he never leave? Walter, the station's oldest ticket clerk, was one of them. He remembered the first time he saw Apollo 5 years ago. It was a cold autumn morning. The dog had appeared out of nowhere, sat near the entrance, and stayed. At first, Walter thought he was just another stray, another forgotten soul in a world that moved too fast. But as the days passed, Apollo never left. And the strangest thing? Every time a train arrived, he would spring to his feet, his brown eyes wide with anticipation, hopeful. And every time the doors closed and the train pulled away, he would lie back down. His eyes would dim. Walter began caring for him quietly, leaving out scraps of bread, a small bowl of water, speaking to him in soft murmurs, as if trying to ease his silent suffering. But nothing changed. Not the cold, not the storms, not the passing of seasons. Paulo kept waiting. For whom? For what? No one knew. Until one night something happened. Something that would change everything. The night was cold and merciless. A thin mist clung to the station, weaving through the empty benches and broken tiles. The flickering streetlights cast weak, trembling glows on the pavement, barely cutting through the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a lone car rumbled down the road before disappearing into silence. Apollo lay curled on the damp concrete, his thin body rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. His fur, once thick and golden, was now dull and matted, evidence of the years that had passed. Yet, despite the cold, the hunger, and the endless solitude, he remained. His eyes, dark and hollow, never strayed from the tracks. From inside the ticket booth, Walter watched. He had seen this ritual play out too many times. The waiting, the hope, the heartbreak. He stepped outside, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached with a small plastic container. "Got you something, buddy," he murmured, placing it down. "A bit of chicken and rice, better than nothing." Paulo didn't react. His ears twitched slightly, but his gaze stayed fixed on the distance. And then, as if on cue, the familiar low hum of the approaching train filled the air. Walter let out a breath. Paulo tensed. His muscles, weak from time and hardship, still managed to gather enough strength to lift his frail body. His tail gave a slow, hopeful wag as the train screeched to a stop. The doors slid open, and Apollo's eyes darted from face to face. Searching, waiting, Walter swallowed hard, already knowing how this would end. One by one, passengers stepped off. Some hurried past, pulling their coats tight. Others glanced briefly at the dog before turning away. The final passenger exited. The whistle blew. The doors slid shut. And just like that, Apollo lowered himself back to the ground, defeated. His ears drooped, his tail stilled. The hope in his eyes vanished, swallowed by the darkness once again. Walter sighed, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. He had tried for years to uncover Apollo's story. He had asked around, looked for old lost dog posters, even tried following him once. But there were no answers. Only a question that no one could answer. "Who are you waiting for, boy?" he whispered. Apollo didn't move. Walter turned his gaze to the empty tracks, a gnawing thought settling in his chest. Maybe Apollo wasn't just waiting for someone. Maybe he was waiting for someone who was never coming back. The morning was heavy with fog, a thick veil that blurred the outlines of buildings and crept through the empty streets like a ghost unwilling to leave. The sky hung low and gray, suffocating the town in an eerie stillness. The ground was still damp from last night's rain, and the station smelled of wet pavement and rusted metal. Apollo remained in his usual spot, his body curled tight against the cold. His eyes locked on the tracks as if the answer to his suffering would one day appear there. Walter arrived earlier than usual, his breath visible in the crisp air. He moved stiffly, his bones aching from the years of work and bitter winters. But it wasn't the cold that made his chest tighten this morning. It was Apollo. The dog had barely moved since the last train left the night before. Walter had seen him like this before, waiting, hoping, breaking. He sighed, pulling his worn coat tighter around himself. 5 years. 5 long years. How could a creature so small carry such an unbearable weight? He set down his thermos on the counter and rubbed his hands together, trying to shake the chill from his fingers. His mind was restless. Who had Apollo belonged to? No dog waited this long for no reason. Someone had been here before. Someone he loved, someone he had lost. But who? And why had no one come looking for him? The questions gnawed at Walter, sinking deeper into his thoughts with every passing day. A sudden idea struck him. Maybe there was something he had missed. Something in the station's past that could explain why Apollo refused to leave. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the heavy door to the records room. The space was cluttered with stacks of yellowed papers and dust-coated files, the scent of old ink and forgotten time filling the air. If Apollo had been waiting for 5 years, then maybe, just maybe, his story had left a mark somewhere in these records. Walter flipped through faded maintenance logs and incident reports, his fingers tracing over dates and notes scribbled in hurried handwriting. Most were unremarkable. Delays, mechanical failures, lost luggage. But then, buried beneath a pile of outdated employee rosters, he found it. A train accident. 5 years ago. His breath caught in his throat as he scanned the report. It had happened on a rainy night just like last night. A man had been struck on the tracks. The details were sparse, almost cold in their precision. No name, no family listed, just a single sentence that sent a shiver down Walter's spine. Believed to be traveling with a dog. No animal was found at the scene. Walter slowly lifted his eyes from the paper and turned toward Apollo. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. But suddenly, Walter saw him differently. Had Apollo been waiting for someone who was never coming back? Walter sat in the dimly lit records room, the paper in his hands trembling ever so slightly. The faded ink, the brittle texture of the old report. None of it should have mattered, but it did. The words stared back at him, cold and indifferent. A train accident. A man. A missing dog. The details were sparse, almost clinical, as if whoever wrote them hadn't thought twice about the life that had been lost that night. But Walter thought about it now, and when he glanced toward the silent figure lying by the tracks, he felt something inside him crack. Apollo hadn't moved since last night. The same stillness, the same unwavering stare. He was always waiting, watching the horizon as if expecting something. Someone. To step off the train and call his name. Walter had seen this ritual unfold for 5 years, but now, for the first time, he felt like he understood. Apollo wasn't just waiting. He was mourning. 5 years of hunger and loneliness. 5 years of clinging to a hope that, deep down, must have been fading with each passing train. Walter swallowed hard, running a hand over his tired face. He had never thought much about the accident before. A man had died. People whispered about it for a few weeks. Then life moved on. That's how it always was. Tragedies became stories, stories became memories, and memories faded until they were nothing more than shadows in the back of people's minds. But not for Apollo. He had never moved on. He had never forgotten. He had stayed. A sudden gust of wind rattled the station's windows, snapping Walter from his thoughts. The morning fog had begun to lift, revealing the damp streets and empty sidewalks of the quiet town. The sun was rising, its pale light stretching over the train tracks like golden threads weaving through the cold metal rails. Walter took a deep breath and stepped outside, his boots crunching against the gravel. He walked toward Apollo, his heart heavy with something he couldn't quite name. He crouched down a few feet away, careful not to startle the dog. For a moment, he just watched him. His thin frame, his worn fur, the way his ribs pressed against his skin. "Apollo," Walter said finally. It was the first time he had spoken the dog's name aloud, and it felt strange, like he was saying something sacred, something that had been lost in the wind for too long. Apollo's ears twitched slightly, but his gaze never left the tracks. Walter hesitated, then continued, his voice quieter now. "I know you're waiting for someone. I know what happened that night." The words felt heavy as they left his mouth, thick with sorrow. Apollo didn't react at first, but then, slowly, as if the weight of Walter's voice had reached him in a way nothing else had, he turned his head. Their eyes met, deep brown pools of pain, longing, and something even stronger, love. A love that had refused to die, even after all these years. Walter exhaled, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He wanted to tell Apollo that it was okay to stop waiting, that whoever he had loved was gone, that he didn't have to do this to himself anymore. But he knew that words wouldn't change anything, because Apollo wasn't just waiting, he was hoping, and hope, no matter how painful, is the hardest thing to let go of. The station was quieter than usual that evening. The sky had darkened into a deep shade of blue, with heavy clouds drifting across the horizon, swallowing the last hints of daylight. A cold wind howled through the empty platform, rattling the loose metal panels on the station roof. The sound was eerie, like a whisper from something unseen, something forgotten. Apollo remained where he always was, curled up against the cold pavement near the edge of the tracks. His body barely moved, but Walter knew he wasn't sleeping. He never really slept. Even in the dead of night, Apollo's ears would twitch at the faintest sound of a passing train, his eyes fluttering open in anticipation. Every whistle, every distant rumble of metal against metal was another chance, another cruel reminder. Walter sat down on the bench nearby, letting out a heavy sigh. The paper from the records room was still in his coat pocket, but he hadn't looked at it since that morning. He didn't need to. He had read enough to understand. The accident, the man who had been hit, the dog that was never found. It was all connected. Apollo had been here that night. He had seen it happen. And still, after all these years, he refused to believe that his person was never coming back. A lump formed in Walter's throat. He wanted to say something, anything that would ease the dog's suffering. But what do you say to a heart that refuses to give up? Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in brown paper. "You gotta eat something, boy," he murmured, breaking off a small piece and placing it in front of Apollo. "Ain't good for you to keep going like this." Apollo didn't move at first, but then, slowly, he lifted his head and sniffed the air. His ribs were sharp beneath his fur, his body too thin from years of neglect. Walter had seen starving dogs before, but Apollo was different. He didn't starve because he had no food. He starved because he was waiting for something more, something that no meal could replace. After a long pause, Apollo took the small bite Walter had left for him. The old man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's it," he said softly. "One step at a time, huh?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of an approaching train. Walter knew what would happen next. Apollo would stand up, eyes full of that same desperate hope, searching the faces in the train windows. And when no one called his name, when no familiar scent reached his nose, he would lie back down, defeated. But as the train's whistle echoed through the station, Walter made a decision. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring back the man Apollo had lost. But maybe, just maybe, he could help him find a new reason to keep going. The station was nearly empty, bathed in the dim glow of flickering streetlights. The night was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and refused to leave. A fine mist curled around the train tracks, stretching into the darkness beyond. The air smelled of damp concrete, rusted metal, and something else, something heavier. A quiet grief that had lingered for far too long. Apollo lay curled up in his usual spot, his frail body barely rising and falling with each breath. His fur, once golden and thick, was dull under the weak light, and Walter couldn't shake the feeling that the dog was growing weaker. 5 years of waiting. 5 years of disappointment. How long could a heart keep holding on before it finally gave up? Walter sat beside him on the cold pavement, ignoring the stiffness in his old joints. He didn't speak at first, just let the silence settle between them. Apollo's eyes remained locked on the tracks, but there was something different tonight. Something in the way his ears drooped, in the way his breathing seemed slower. "You don't have to keep doing this, boy," Walter finally murmured. His voice was rough, thick with something he didn't want to name. "He's not coming back." The words felt cruel, even though he knew they were the truth. Apollo didn't move. He didn't even blink. It was as if Walter's words had passed right through him, unheard, unfelt. Walter sighed, running a hand over his weathered face. "I know what it's like," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Losing someone. Waking up every day thinking maybe, just maybe, it was all a bad dream." His fingers curled into his coat pocket, where the old accident report still sat, folded and worn from being read too many times. A gust of wind blew through the station, ruffling Apollo's fur. He shivered slightly but didn't take his eyes off the tracks. It was as if he was afraid that the moment he looked away, the person he loved would finally return, only to find that he had given up. Walter's chest tightened. He had spent so much time trying to figure out Apollo's story, trying to piece together the past. But what if the past wasn't the answer? What if the real question wasn't who Apollo had lost, but what he had left? For the first time in 5 years, Walter made a decision. He wasn't going to let this dog die waiting for a ghost. "You can't bring him back, boy," Walter said, his voice steady now. "But you don't have to be alone anymore." And for the first time, Apollo turned his head, not toward the tracks, but toward Walter. For the first time in 5 years, Apollo looked away from the tracks. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but to Walter, it felt like the earth had shifted beneath him. Those tired brown eyes, filled with loss and longing, now rested on him, really rested on him. Walter held his breath, afraid that any sudden motion would break whatever fragile moment had just been created between them. The wind howled through the station, carrying with it the distant rumble of a train approaching. Walter expected Apollo to turn back, to fall into the same pattern, the same desperate ritual. But he didn't. He just watched him. It was as if, for the first time, Apollo was beginning to see that there was someone beside him. Walter swallowed hard, his throat tight. "That's it, boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I see you too." He slowly reached out his hand, stopping just a few inches away from Apollo's muzzle. The dog stiffened, his breathing shallow. For years, people had come and gone, offering food, a few kind words, but no one had stayed. No one had truly seen him. Apollo's body trembled, torn between instinct and something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Trust. Walter didn't move. He had spent a lifetime learning patience, and tonight, more than ever, he needed it. "I know it hurts," he murmured. "I know you're still waiting, but you don't have to wait alone anymore." The train's whistle echoed through the empty station, a sharp sound slicing through the cold air. The ground trembled as it approached, slowing, groaning under its own weight. Walter felt Apollo tense beside him, his ears perking up just slightly. He could almost see the hope creeping back into those tired eyes, the flicker of something that had kept him alive all these years. The doors hissed open. A few late-night passengers stepped off, pulling their coats tighter against the wind. Apollo's gaze darted between them, searching, always searching. Walter clenched his jaw, already knowing how this would end. The crowd would thin, the last person would step off, and then Apollo's head would lower again. But then, something different happened. Apollo hesitated. His eyes lingered on the empty platform for a long time, as if waiting for one last miracle. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he turned back toward Walter. Walter's breath caught in his throat. The doors slid shut. The train rumbled forward, disappearing into the night. And for the first time, Apollo didn't watch it go. Instead, he watched Walter. The train was gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond the tracks. But Apollo's eyes didn't chase it this time. He stood still, his body tense, his breath visible in the cold air. Walter could hardly believe it. After 5 years of unwavering devotion to an absence, Apollo had turned away. Not much, not entirely, but enough. Walter let out a slow, steady breath. He knew better than to rush this moment. If he reached too quickly, if he spoke too loud, Apollo might slip back into his old ways. Back to waiting, back to the silent suffering that had defined his existence for so long. So Walter just sat there, his body aching from the cold, his heart beating a little faster than it should for a man his age. "You did good, boy," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to let go all at once. Just one step at a time." Apollo blinked, his ears twitching at Walter's voice. He wasn't sure yet. He wasn't ready. But something had shifted, something fragile and new. A crack in the wall he had built around himself. Walter reached into his pocket, his fingers curling around a small piece of bread. He broke off a bit and placed it on the pavement in front of him. No sudden moves, no expectations, just an offering. "You're not alone, Apollo," he said. "Not anymore." The dog hesitated, his ribs still pressed against his thin skin, his fur still dull and matted from the years of waiting. But hunger was a powerful thing, and tonight, for the first time, it seemed to outweigh his fear. Slowly, so slowly, Apollo took a step forward. His paws were hesitant against the rough pavement, as if the ground beneath him might disappear if he moved too fast. Walter held his breath, his fingers resting lightly on his knee, resisting the urge to reach out. Let him decide. Let him choose. Apollo lowered his head, sniffing the piece of bread. Another pause, another moment of uncertainty. Then, cautiously, he took it between his teeth and swallowed. Walter felt his chest tighten. Apollo had eaten before, of course, scraps from kind strangers, meals left behind by workers passing through. But this felt different. This wasn't just survival. This was acceptance. Walter didn't say anything else. He simply sat there, letting the quiet stretch between them, letting Apollo decide what came next. The dog took another step, closer this time, his dark eyes locked onto Walter's. Not quite trust, not yet, but hope. For the first time in 5 years, hope. The night was colder than usual, but for the first time in 5 years, Apollo wasn't lying against the freezing pavement, waiting for something that would never come. He was still there, still close to the tracks, still watching, but something was different now. His body wasn't as tense. His gaze, though cautious, was no longer hollow. And most importantly, he had moved closer to Walter. The old man sat with his hands resting on his knees, watching Apollo with quiet patience. He didn't dare speak, didn't dare break the fragile moment between them. Everything had led to this: the quiet offerings, the whispered reassurances, the endless nights spent in the cold. And now, Apollo had chosen to stay near him instead of the tracks. Walter swallowed against the lump forming in his throat. "You're getting there, boy," he murmured, his voice hoarse with something he couldn't quite name. One step at a time. Apollo blinked, his ears twitching at the sound of Walter's voice. He was still uncertain, still trapped between the past and whatever future waited for him. But there was no mistaking it now. The waiting had changed. It wasn't just about what he had lost anymore. It was about what he had left. Walter shifted slightly, careful not to startle him. From his pocket, he pulled out an old scarf, soft, warm, worn from years of use. Without thinking much about it, he set it down beside Apollo, a quiet offering. "It's not much, but it'll keep you warm," he said softly. "Not that you ever seem to care about the cold." Apollo hesitated. He sniffed the fabric, his body tensing slightly as if expecting something unfamiliar, something unsafe. But then, just as slowly as before, he did something Walter hadn't dared hope for. He lowered himself onto the scarf. Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The wind howled, rattling the station roof. The tracks stretched into the distance, disappearing into the unknown, the same as they always had. But tonight, for the first time, Apollo wasn't watching them. He was watching Walter. Something deep inside the old man ached, something he had buried long ago. He had spent most of his life at this station, watching people leave, watching them say goodbye. He had always thought he had made peace with solitude. But now, looking at Apollo curled up beside him, he realized something. Neither of them were meant to be alone. The final train of the night whistled in the distance. Apollo's ears perked slightly, but he didn't move. He didn't stand up. He didn't prepare to search the faces stepping off the train. He just stayed where he was. Walter exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. He reached out slowly, hesitating only for a second before resting his hand gently on Apollo's head. And this time, Apollo didn't pull away. The station was quiet. The wind had settled, the mist had lifted, and for the first time in 5 years, Apollo wasn't lying alone on the cold pavement. He was still there, curled up beside Walter, but something had shifted. The weight of the past, the endless waiting, the heartbreak, the loneliness, felt lighter, almost as if the night itself had exhaled a long-held breath. Walter sat with his back against the bench, his hand resting gently on Apollo's head. His fingers moved in slow, careful strokes, brushing over the dog's worn fur. Apollo didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He had stopped waiting for a ghost. "You're a stubborn old thing," Walter murmured with a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Guess we have that in common." Apollo blinked up at him, his deep brown eyes reflecting something that Walter hadn't seen before. Not just sadness, not just longing, but acceptance. For 5 years, Apollo had refused to leave, chained to the past by nothing but hope and memory. And for 5 years, Walter had watched, helpless, knowing there was nothing he could do to change the past. But tonight, under the pale glow of the station lights, something had finally changed. The last train of the night approached, its distant whistle cutting through the silence. The ground trembled beneath them as it slowed to a stop, the doors sliding open with a familiar hiss. Walter felt Apollo tense beside him, his ears perking up slightly. But this time, the dog didn't stand. He didn't search the faces stepping onto the platform. He just watched, quietly, as the train emptied and prepared to leave again. Walter held his breath. The doors beeped, the whistle blew, and then, for the first time in 5 years, Apollo turned away before the train did. Walter's chest tightened. That was it. That was the moment. The one thing he had been waiting to see. Not a dramatic goodbye. Not a grand realization. Just a simple, quiet choice. Apollo had finally let go. The train pulled away, its rumbling fading into the distance. The station was empty again, just as it always was at this hour. But tonight it felt different. Lighter, warmer, not abandoned, not forgotten, just quieter. Walter pushed himself to his feet, his knees cracking from the effort. He looked down at Apollo, who was still curled up on the scarf he had given him. "Come on, boy," he said softly, his voice steady. "Let's go home." For a second, Apollo didn't move. But then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes met Walter's. And then, finally, he stood up. Side by side, an old man and an old dog stepped away from the station together. For the first time, Apollo wasn't waiting. He was moving forward. And this time, he wasn't alone.